I'm just going to spend a few minutes here, brief message, to just encourage you with the hope of Christ. Don's already said some great things about that, so I'm just going to add a few more details from John chapter 11. So if you're at home and you have a Bible in front of you, or you want to pull one up on your computer or your phone, you can do that. I'm going to be in John chapter 11. The situation we're in, as Don talked about earlier, is one none of us would choose for ourselves. We're kind of being forced to go through this right now, and we can't escape the reality of the fear of death, death itself, and then the fear of it. And I'm sure that you are in touch with that in some way. Some of you have done better than others at just kind of going on with life as much as you can and not thinking too much about it, not getting caught up in the doom and gloom. And others of you have done the deep dive in the doom and gloom thing. And that just has to do with all sorts of things in terms of how we're wired and so on and so forth. But we are all in touch with death and the fear of death. We can't escape it. And I want you to just think about how impactful, how influential the fear of death is. I mean, really, the fear of death is what literally shut our world down. I mean, our lives are different. They're different for us individually. They're different in our country and the whole globe. I mean, globally, everything is shut down. And why is that the case? Because of the fear of death. We could say death itself, which is afflicting more people than we would like to think it's afflicting, but then there's also just the fear of death. Even those of us who are not really at risk or who would easily get over this illness, nevertheless, the fear of death is what has all of us crippled right now. And one of the things that's still so compelling for me regarding the God of the Bible, that Christ, how he reveals God and God's heart to us, God's character to us, one of the things that's most compelling about the Christian message and the gospel and the person and work of Jesus is that it shows us a God who's not detached, not disconnected, but who enters into human suffering, who is willing to be acquainted with the hardest parts of life, including death itself. And so in John 11, that's what we see. We see Jesus with a family he knew really well. Lazarus has died. That's the context. His friend Lazarus has died. He had spent lots of time with Lazarus and his sisters Mary and Martha. He knew this family well. Lazarus has died, and the disciples are discouraged. I think they're questioning why he allowed that to happen, and certainly Lazarus' sisters are wondering why he allowed it to happen. So that's the context of it. I'm just going to read and make a few observations that are hopefully encouraging to you in terms of who your Creator God is. So start with me in verse 17 of John 11. It says, "So when Jesus came, he found that that's Lazarus, he had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. Martha, therefore, when she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary stayed at the house. Martha then said to Jesus, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you.' Jesus said to her, 'Your brother will rise again.' Martha said to him, 'I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day.' Jesus said to her, 'I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies.'" And I'm going to read that again. I want you to hear that. I hope that sinks in for you. I'm going to say a lot about that as we move through the message. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies." And then he goes on, "And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world." When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha met him. Then the Jews who were with her in the house and consoling her, when they saw that Mary got up quickly and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him and fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in spirit and was troubled, and said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And look at verse 35. Jesus wept. And why don't we pause there for a second? Jesus wept. Shortest verse in all the Bible. 2 words. Jesus wept. So meaningful. As you are following the news, and I know all of you are to one degree or another following the news, and you see the meter where they're monitoring, they're tracking the number of deaths worldwide and in our country, and that number just goes up and up and up. And I don't know about you, but I'm becoming like desensitized. They're just numbers on a screen. It's kind of like the victims of this thing are being dehumanized in my mind. And I have not shed one tear, not yet. I'm sure if someone close to me is afflicted, I will absolutely shed tears over it. But to this point, I haven't. They're just numbers on a screen. But to God, they're not just numbers on a screen. God understands better than we do human suffering. He understands the toll of death. He's familiar with every single individual, every person who is important to others, everyone who is either a grandfather, a grandmother, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter. Every one of these people important to others and important to God. And in this situation, we can see in kind of like a small little vignette here, a little story, we see Jesus entering into a really difficult, sad environment where people have died, and he is not unmoved. He's deeply moved. He feels it. He feels the human weakness of loss and grief. It's pretty amazing that the God who created all things, who is over all, who is even over death itself, sovereign over it, he allows himself to be touched by it. Here, in terms of losing a friend, losing a loved one, and we know later, not long after this, he will go to his own death. It's pretty amazing to think of a God who would enter in that way, who would sympathize with all of our weaknesses, who would experience the same things that we experience, the hardest parts of life. It's pretty amazing when you think about his willingness to do that, what that says about his heart, what that says about, ironically, what that says about God's humility, that God would learn of a friend dying and that he would cry. So just before I go any farther, think about what you're going through. Maybe you have not shed one tear yet either, but maybe you're afraid that you will have to. Maybe that fear's been profound for you. Maybe you've lost sleep over it. You find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, tossing and turning, wonder where is this thing going and what's going to happen? I mean, that is human. That is normal. It's part of being in touch with the reality of the situation. It's part of living in a fallen world. You know what that feels like. You know what that fear of death feels like and how it can just enslave you. And it can enslave me. Well, Jesus felt it. He allowed himself to feel it. Verse 36 goes on. Let's read the rest of the story. So the Jews were saying, "See how he loved him?" Some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man also from dying?" Kind of thinking, God, I mean, if you're really the Son of God, if you're really the Messiah, you failed us. Why wouldn't you have stopped this from happening? Why do you let bad things like this happen, God? That's really the underlying question. And then verse 38, and this is amazing too, because not only do we see that Jesus cares and that he suffers with his people and that he weeps, but we also see in this passage Jesus' commitment, his zealous, even aggressive commitment to conquer death. We sang earlier, some of the songs, the words, God is alive. God is a God of life. We were saying, Don and I recorded a little video a few days ago, and we were talking about the springtime and how the sun is shining and the birds are singing and the flowers are blossoming and trees are budding and grass is growing. There are all these signs of life all around us, a reflection of the life-giving God. And simultaneously, as all that's happening, here's this invisible, as our president calls it, the invisible enemy, wreaking havoc, taking lives. Simultaneously, those two things are going on. Listen, as much as we can become preoccupied with, in an unhealthy way, even obsessed with death, we can be drawn into the doom and gloom. We can feel the presence of the grim reaper, and that feels hopeless and helpless. As much as we can get stuck there, the God who created all things, the God who upholds all things by the word of his power, our God is not afraid of death. Our God is not victimized by death. Our God is over death, and he is determined to conquer death. And what Christ does here is he shows the will and determination of God to defeat death for us. The book of Romans says that death came into this world through man. That death is a humanly manufactured problem in a very real sense. Yes, God is over it, and he engineered life in such a way that it happens. But we could say, in one sense, man is the originator of death in a very real sense. And God says, because it's your problem, I'm making it my problem, and I'm going to solve it for you. I'm coming to rescue you. So Jesus here, and this is really coming from this word. In your English Bible, it's not as obvious, but in verse 38 you see it. It actually was in verse 33 as well, but it says he was moved deeply within. It's this idea, the word has this connotation of tenacity and aggression. It's Christ confronting death. It's not, some people say, well, it's Jesus mad at the people. It's not Jesus mad at the people. He just cried with the people. It's Jesus determined to vanquish death itself. It says he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. In verse 39, Jesus said, remove the stone. Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be a stench, for he's been dead for 4 days. You're like, 4 days too late, man. He's already decomposing. Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they removed the stone, and Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it so that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. And Jesus said to him, unbind him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. There is the fear. For me personally, it's more the fear of what might happen to loved ones, family members, friends of mine who are in the high-risk category. I suppose in some ways we're all at risk, but I think mainly of those people. And I think of what that could mean in terms of the loss, the grief. And if you have a pulse, I'm guessing you've thought of that same thing. And you hear in this passage Jesus proclaiming earlier, he says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And I want you to think about that. Even if I die, even if you die, we will live. We will live because of Christ. We will live because of what he's done for us. Not long after this story plays out, Jesus has rescued this man, Lazarus, from death and set him free. And then he's really rescued the whole family and all the friends as well. And the comfort and the relief, you can only imagine what that must have felt like when they saw Lazarus walking out of the tomb. And he has the same promise for us that though we don't know what's going to happen on this, that we can't know. Honestly, I'm optimistic that we're going to get through this, that we're going to be fine. Our country's going to be fine. I believe that. I believe there's good evidence of that. I believe and I hope that most, if not all, the people in our church are going to be fine and get through this. But I can't guarantee it. What I can guarantee, not because of me, but because of Christ, what I can guarantee is that we will live even if we die. That we will live even if we die. And that just as Lazarus stands up and and he is unbound from the cloths that were in a visual way kind of entangling him. So also we too one day are going to be set free. We're so scared of death, naturally speaking, but it is literally like the chains falling off. We're going to be free. Free from sin, free from brokenness, free from pain and grief and sorrow and suffering. We're going to be free. And Jesus has accomplished this for us. That's why this book, written by countless different authors thousands of years ago, inspired by God, that's why this book still gives me a sense of hope, as Don shared earlier, a real hope, a lasting hope, a much stronger hope than the false hopes of this world. So I'm thankful for it. I hope that's encouraging to you. I hope it's been good for you to sit in on our service here from home. I hope you've been encouraged by what you've heard. I hope that the reality of God's heart, who he is, and his commitment to conquer death and to cause all of death to be swallowed up by life, and that the view of eternity is encouraging to you. I hope that's the case. Thanks again for tuning in today. Feel free to share through comments how you've been encouraged today, and keep in touch with one another and enjoy. Those of you who are living with weather like we have here in Washington right now, enjoy the outdoors, get outside, and see evidence of God's kindness, evidence of God's life. And remember that death is a very small experience. It's a very short thing relative to eternal life. It can't even be measured how small it is by comparison. So let me pray, and then we'll close our service, okay? God, thank you so much for your word. Thank you so much for your hope that you offer us. Thank you for being a God who cares, God who enters into human suffering. Through Christ's work, God, you allowed yourself to be touched by death, the loss of a loved one, and then even Jesus going through death himself, the worst of human physical experience, and even being touched by sin, the worst of human spiritual experience, being touched by all of it to come save us. Thank you so much for your deliverance. Thank you for the liberation you granted to us through Christ. And I pray that everyone who's watching today or in the future, watching a recording of this, I pray that people would be uplifted, that you would give them a glimmer of light and help them to see beyond whatever the doom and gloom. If they're stuck there in the darkness of this, I pray you'd help them to see light, see that you are a God of life, and that you have promised us eternal life. Help us to see the amazing, infinitely valuable hope we have because of Christ, and help us to live with measures of freedom as a result of that. And we long for the day when we'll finally be free, home with you forever. Thank you again, God, for allowing us to do this today, for allowing us to have this service. And thank you for meeting with each one of us through your Spirit and through the truth that we've heard. In Jesus' name I pray.